The mirror shows what's behind me, and it's not human. True horror story. There are stories about mirrors people refuse to repeat, stories of reflections that don't belong to anyone living. But what happened to me was far worse. I never believed in curses, hauntings, or objects that should have stayed buried. Yet one mirror proved me wrong. What it showed behind me wasn't human, and once it saw me, it never let me go. Before this ends, you'll understand why. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for most of my life, I lived in a quiet Illinois suburb where nothing strange ever happened. I worked as a night custodian at a local historical museum, a job I liked because it gave me peace and isolation. I preferred silence. After losing my father 3 years earlier and ending a long-term relationship shortly after, I built my life around work, routine, and long stretches of empty evenings. I didn't socialize much. Most people didn't notice, and I didn't mind staying invisible. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment near the museum, a place filled with mismatched furniture, hand-me-down decor, and old photographs of my family from before everything fell apart. Nothing in my life felt permanent, but it was consistent. Routine was my anchor, a fragile anchor I never expected to lose. But everything changed the night the museum director asked me to help catalog a newly arrived collection from an old Victorian estate. The items were dusty, cracked, and heavy with age. There were boxes of books, frames with peeling gold leaf, and strange antiques that looked as if they carried entire lives inside them. I was supposed to sort them and log their condition. But one object stood out from all the rest: a tall, ornate mirror wrapped in a brittle white cloth. Its wooden frame was dark mahogany carved with twisted vines and silhouettes of creatures that didn't resemble anything found in nature. Something about it felt wrong, as if the carvings were watching me even before I unwrapped it. The museum director told me it came from the Hargrove estate, a house known locally for rumors, disappearances, and tragedies. He dismissed all the gossip as nonsense, but the longer I stared at the mirror, the less nonsense it sounded. Still, I logged the item number, cleaned the surface, and moved it to the back room where damaged items were usually stored. At the time, I didn't know that would be the worst mistake of my life. That night, after I clocked out and walked home, I found myself thinking about the mirror. Not its beauty or its craftsmanship, but its reflection. When I cleaned it earlier, I could have sworn the room behind me seemed darker in the glass than it was in reality. I even thought I saw a faint shape near the archway, something tall that didn't fit the room's layout. I blamed exhaustion, brushed it off, and went home. But the image lingered like a stain in my mind. The next evening, I returned to the museum as usual. But as I walked past the storage rooms, I noticed something unsettling. The mirror wasn't where I had left it. It wasn't leaning against the wall on the right side of the room. It was standing straight on the opposite side. No one should have moved it. No one else had keys to that room. At first, I assumed the director had checked on it without telling me. But when I asked him later, he said he hadn't entered that room since the shipment arrived. I should have told him something felt wrong. But I didn't want to sound paranoid. Instead, I finished my shift and tried to ignore the creeping anxiety clawing at my ribs. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched all night. On my way out, curiosity took control of me. I returned to the storage room and stood before the mirror again. The room behind me looked normal, but my reflection, something was off. The outline of my shoulders seemed slightly blurred, as if a faint distortion rippled around me. When I leaned closer, the distortion sharpened into something like a shadow hugging the edge of my reflection. A shape that looked almost like a hand resting on my shoulder. But there was nothing there, only my reflection in the room's dim light. I reminded myself that mirrors from the Victorian era often had imperfections. It wasn't supernatural. It was just old, just damaged. I repeated that thought as I turned off the lights and left, but my chest was tight with dread. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up with the sense that someone was standing near my bed, leaning over me, waiting for me to open my eyes. 3 nights later, everything escalated. I had been reorganizing artifacts and pushing heavy carts all evening. When I finally walked back into the mirror room to finish logging inventory, the temperature felt noticeably colder. The air had a faint metallic smell, like wet iron. The mirror stood exactly where I'd seen it last, but its surface seemed darker, like the glass had thickened. The corners of the frame appeared slightly different, almost as if the carved creatures had shifted positions. That was when I saw it. In the reflection, behind my left shoulder, the room stretched farther back than it physically did. There was a long, shadowy hallway that did not exist in the real world. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, motionless. Its limbs were obscured by darkness, but its face, or where a face should have been, was an empty oval of pale, colorless skin. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. I froze, unable to breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed that turning around was the last thing I should do. Instead, I watched the figure through the mirror. Slowly, it tilted its head, not toward me but downward, as if observing my reflection rather than my actual body. Then the lights in the storage room flickered. Not in the mirror, only in reality. I stumbled backward and forced myself to look away from the glass. When I finally turned around, the room was empty. No hallway, no figure, only rows of covered artifacts and dusty boxes. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone from the reflection too. I wanted to leave right then, but terror paralyzed me. Something inside me insisted that the mirror wasn't just showing reflections, it was showing possibilities. Or worse, things that waited beyond possibilities. I gathered my belongings and rushed home, feeling watched the entire way. Every dark window on the street looked like an open eye. Every reflective surface, car windows, puddles, glass doors, felt like an invitation for something to look back at me through them. That night, I covered the mirror in my bathroom and turned every photograph face down. I slept with the lights on. Yet sometime during the early morning hours, I woke with a jolt. My bedroom felt colder than before. And when I opened my eyes, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. The mirror on my closet door, the one I had covered earlier, was uncovered, and something stood behind me in the reflection. The thing in the mirror did not move when I first noticed it. That was what terrified me the most. It wasn't lunging, crawling, or reaching. It simply stood there, occupying the space behind my reflection as if it had always belonged there. The shape was taller than me, its outline distorted, like it didn't fully understand the human form it was mimicking. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt, as if my mind was trying to reject what my eyes insisted was real. I forced myself to breathe. I told myself exhaustion was playing tricks on me, that I was hallucinating. I slowly reached behind me, extending my hand toward where the reflection suggested the figure stood. My fingers touched nothing but cold air. Yet in the mirror, the figure reacted. Its head tilted slightly, not in curiosity, but in recognition. It knew I could see it. I spun around, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. My room was empty. No figure, no movement, just my unmade bed and the dim glow of the hallway light bleeding under the door. When I turned back to the mirror, the thing was still there. It was closer now, its shape more defined, as though my attention fed its substance. I stumbled backward and slammed the closet door shut, trapping the mirror inside. The impact echoed through the apartment. I pressed my back against the door, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. I stayed there until the sun rose, terrified to move, terrified to sleep. The following days blurred together in a haze of dread. I avoided mirrors entirely. I shaved in the dark. I covered reflective surfaces with towels, blankets, even trash bags. But it didn't matter. I began seeing it in places that shouldn't reflect anything at all. In the black screen of my phone. In the darkened glass of my oven. Even in my dreams, where it stood at impossible angles, always just behind me, always waiting. I returned to the museum hoping answers existed there. The mirror had to be documented somewhere. There had to be records. I spent hours digging through old archives, estate inventories, and handwritten journals from the Hargrove family. What I found made my stomach turn. The mirror was known as a threshold piece, believed to be crafted by an unknown artisan in the late 1800s. According to scattered notes, it was never meant to reflect the living. It was designed to show what lingered behind them. Several Hargrove family members reportedly became obsessed with it, spending hours staring into its surface. They claimed it revealed truths others couldn't see. Within months, the household fell apart. Disappearances. Sudden deaths. One final entry mentioned that the mirror was sealed away after something stepped through. I barely finished reading before I felt it again. That sensation of being observed. Slowly, I raised my head toward the glass display case beside me. My reflection stared back, pale and exhausted. And behind me, faint but unmistakable, stood the figure. This time, it smiled. Or at least, the skin where its mouth should have stretched unnaturally, forming a dark that should not exist on a face like that. Panic seized me. I dropped the journal and ran. I didn't clock out. I didn't explain. I just fled. That night, the apartment felt different. Heavier. The air pressed against my skin like damp fabric. The lights flickered even though the power was stable. Every mirror I had covered was uncovered again. Not ripped away, not disturbed, just neatly exposed as if someone had carefully removed the coverings. I understood then that the mirror was no longer the only gateway. The thing no longer needed glass to follow me. I locked myself in the bathroom, the smallest room with no mirrors. I sat on the floor, knees to my chest, whispering to myself that it wasn't real. But the walls seemed to pulse softly, as if the apartment itself was breathing. Then I heard movement behind me, not footsteps, but something shifting its weight, learning gravity. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I felt its presence press closer, a cold pressure against my spine. Images flooded my mind, reflections of places I'd never been, shadows wearing human shapes, endless corridors filled with watching eyes. The thing wasn't trying to scare me anymore. It was trying to understand me, to learn how to exist the way I did. I realized the truth too late. The mirror never showed what was behind you physically. It showed what was attached to you, what followed unseen, what waited for permission. And I had given it that permission the moment I stared too long. The pressure lifted suddenly. Silence swallowed the room. When I dared to look, I was alone. But something inside me felt hollowed out, like a door had been left open and something had stepped through. Days passed, then weeks. The fear dulled, replaced by numbness. I started noticing things about myself that felt wrong. My reflections sometimes moved a fraction of a second too late. Shadows lingered longer than they should. And occasionally, when I passed a mirror, I saw myself smiling when I wasn't. I stopped going to work, stopped answering calls. I avoided people. I didn't trust my own presence anymore. The final confirmation came one night when I caught my reflection standing behind me in the mirror while I was facing it. That was when I understood. It wasn't following me anymore. It had replaced me. If you're watching this and think mirrors are harmless, I urge you to be careful. Some reflections don't belong to the living. If this story unsettled you, subscribe now for more true horror experiences.